So good morning to delegates and friends. We have come to the second day of the Roundtable. First order of the day for this morning, I would like to invite Ms. Nirmala Devi Wintickle, the Secretary General of Global BERSIH, to give an opening speech.
A very good morning to the representative of the Speaker's Office. A warm welcome again to my fellow organizers, Thomas Fan, Chairperson of BERSIH, Corinne Momal-Vavian, Executive Director of Kofi Annan Foundation, our distinguished speakers and panelists, Member of Parliaments, Senators, and my fellow Malaysians. The last 5 years have been transition years for Malaysia. The country had to navigate many challenges, ranging from the global pandemic to a change of 4 prime ministers in 5 years. I can only say Malaysia boleh. Through all the challenges, Malaysia has always strived towards a healthy democratic journey guided by the leaders and most importantly, the rakyat, people. Global BERSIH is very proud to be a part of this journey. After achieving a much anticipated change at the federal level in the 14th general election, Global BERSIH's then President, Bala Chaleya, approached Kofi Annan Foundation with an idea to organize a roundtable in Malaysia. With Kofi Annan Foundation's expertise and the local partner BERSIH's support, the roundtable, the way forward to fair and free election, focusing on electoral reform, was held at this very spot in 2018. Years later, here we are again talking about another very timely and important theme. The concept of a coalition is familiar to us, as our political parties have worked together as a group with shared interests even before our country's independence. The real challenge now lies in the idea of governing as a coalition government and working towards creating a healthy and conducive environment for governing the nation. The emergence of a coalition government is the beginning of a new political era for Malaysia. Echoing the words of our former Dewan Rakyat Speaker, Tan Sri Arif Yusof, during his speech at the last roundtable, the results of our electoral reforms must not merely be to have clean, fair and free elections, but also for Malaysia to become a robust multi-party democracy. This event is an excellent opportunity to strengthen governance by the coalition in Malaysia. Yesterday we had the privilege of listening to experts talk about how to find political stability in a hung government, then proceeded to the role of the opposition and shadow cabinet. We also spoke about how to steer a post-election coalition government. I took note of 5 top terms that were repeated throughout the day: transparent conduct, code of ethics, public participation, check and balance, respect, constructive opposition, and trust. I know that was more than 5, but I liked some of the terms and didn't want to leave them out. The ideas behind these terms are what we can use to guide our path to identify the opportunities hidden behind the challenges that we are facing today. Today, we will talk about how to empower the parliamentarians and the role of media and civil society. We hope that the outcome from this roundtable can and will be used as building blocks for better governance or a hammer to break the walls and obstacles in our journey towards creating sustainable reform. Global BERSIH represents a very unique group of Malaysians living in overseas. Many might think, why would Malaysians in overseas are interested in reform and changes in the nation? But your Malaysia is the same Malaysia we have. We have only one nation that we are all working together towards. I thank our partners at BERSIH and Kofi Annan Foundation for their support and effort in organizing this event. I also thank the Speaker of Parliament for providing us this monumental venue. Thanks to the European Union, the High Commission of Canada, the Australian High Commission for their support in making this event successful. Thank you to the fantastic panels and speakers and, of course, all the volunteers that made this so successful. Most of all, thank you all the participants for joining us today in our journey to create the Malaysia we want and the one we deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nirmala. So without further ado, let us just begin with the sessions, the following sessions. So taking on with the discussions of what we have left yesterday, today we will discuss 2 sessions focusing on stakeholder, including the parliamentarian, civil society, and the media. So the next sessions will be on empowering parliamentarians. I would like to invite the moderator, Mr. Declan O'Brien, to come on stage to moderate these sessions and introduce the panelists. Declan is the head of Elections and Democracy Program in Kofi Annan Foundation. He also has vast experience in humanitarian and peacekeeping operation. Declan, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and Namala, thank you for that good recap of the discussions yesterday. This panel this morning, our penultimate panel, is about empowering politicians, particularly opposition and backbench MPs. And I think it's very much at the heart of the discussions for this conference. As we talked about yesterday, democracy is more than just the elections. It's about governance. And after all the negotiations are done and all the voting is done, MPs need to be able to come to this place. They need to be able to meet and discuss. They need to be able to propose and pass laws and policies in the interests of... I'm not that tall. Thanks. They need to be able to act in the best interest of their constituents and indeed the people of Malaysia as a whole. And that question, how we can empower them to do so, is very much at the center of our discussions today. So how can opposition and backbench MPs be empowered to play a constructive role in what can be a rather fractious relationship of a post-coalition government? And this is never straightforward. I think even in single-party instances, this is always a tense issue. But hopefully our panelists will be able to help us today with some ideas. We, of course, will be building on some of the thoughts that came up yesterday. We touched on the role of shadow cabinets and the opposition. We touched on the role of select committees. And there were some questions around how you can ensure oversight within a post-election coalition government. Now, I think we have a great panel today. I think one that's certainly capable of living up to the high standards set by the discussants yesterday. First and foremost, we have Mala Balakrishnan, who, according to everybody I've spoken, she denies it, but according to everybody I've spoken to, she is one of the country's foremost experts on parliamentary affairs. She is a lawyer by training and currently a research fellow at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and also the principal facilitator of the National Democratic Institute. So, Maya, you're very welcome. Next, we have Kelvin Yee, who, as I understand it, is a doctor, a lawyer, and a member of parliament. So his parents are very disappointed, I'm sure. He served as the special advisor to the Minister of Health, also as chair to the Parliamentary Select Committee on Health, Science and Innovation. But previous to that, he was also on the Committee on Budget and now serves on the Committee of International Trade and Relations. And last, but actually first, is Markku Jokisipilä, who is director of the Center of Parliamentary Studies at the University of Turku in Finland. He is a highly regarded commentator and academic and political expert on Finnish political history and politics. And it's particularly timely, I think, that we have him with us today because, as some of you may know, Finland held an election just over a month ago, I think it was, and are currently in the process, several parties are currently in the process of negotiating a post-election coalition. So it's great that we have him here to be able to benefit from his expertise. And without further ado, I'll turn over to him to make our initial presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Declan, for your kind words of introduction. Your Excellencies, esteemed members of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here in this extremely important and fascinating event. I would like to thank Kofi Annan Foundation, the BERSIH, the Speaker of the Parliament of Malaysia, and all the other organizers for the invitation to speak here. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to present you with the experiences of my own country, Finland, in making the multi-party coalition democracy work. And exactly like Declan just told you, we are currently in the process of forming a government, and it's not easy, but I think that once again we will be having a new government in Finland in just a couple of weeks' time. And I promised Declan that my presentation is going to last from 15 minutes to 20 minutes, and I try to keep that promise, although it's not easy because I have so many things to tell you. I have to start with a brief introduction to Finnish history, for I do not assume that you all here are familiar with Finnish history. Finland is a parliamentary republic where the power is held by the people who on their behalf are represented by the parliament and 200 MPs in the parliament. The parliament is unicameral and it has elections every 4 years. We just had the parliamentary elections in the beginning of April, and now 4 parties in the current parliament are in the process of forming a new government. Finland became independent from under the rule of Imperial Russia in 1917. Only after 7 weeks of independence, a civil war broke out between the bourgeois whites and the working class reds, as the socialists felt that the reforms could not be achieved without a revolution. In the interwar years, in 1920s, 1930s, country was mostly governed by parties in the political center and in the political right. Communist Party was illegal all the way up to 1944. During the Second World War, Finland fought 3 different campaigns. First, it had to defend itself alone against the offensive by Soviet Union in 1939-1940 in the Winter War. Then in 1941 to 1944, it fought alongside Hitler's Germany, National Socialist Germany, against Soviet Union in the so-called Continuation War. Lastly, in 1944 to 1945, it had to drive the Germans out of the country in Lapland War. 100,000 Finns lost their lives during the war years. Country had to cede large areas to Soviet Union. But the country remained independent and it didn't abandon its democratic constitution at any point in time. It wasn't occupied by any outside country, and it didn't. It wasn't occupied by any outside power during any point in time in the war years, and this was a rare achievement in European history during the Second World War. Most of the countries were occupied by at least Germany or Soviet Union at some point in time. After the war in 1940s, 1950s, life was filled with tasks of reconstruction and gradual return to a full membership in the international community for Finland. Country's freedom of maneuver was restricted by the fact that it was tightly in the Soviet sphere of influence and Soviet sphere of interest, and had to take Moscow's interests into account in its foreign and security political decision making. Finland was not a member of the Warsaw Pact, but a neutral country, although Finnish neutrality was considerably more restricted compared, for example, to that of Finland's western neighbor, Sweden. However, in 1960s, 70s and 80s, Finland was able to build a Nordic welfare state in the world record speed and become one of the wealthiest countries in the whole world. The most important political axis of cooperation was the axis between the Social Democrats on the one hand and the Centre Party, the former Agrarian Union, on the other. Political culture was marked by the strong position of the President of the Republic, who was in charge of foreign policy, who was nominating the governments, and who even had the power to dissolve the parliament and order new elections. The current Finnish president no longer has this power. With the end of the Cold War and dissolution of Soviet Union, Finland was able to head west with full speed and became a member in the European Union in 1995, January. After Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, this Western orientation was finalized when Finland applied for membership in North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO and became a full member only a month ago. This was a major turning point in Finnish foreign and security policy, as the country had been militarily non-aligned for 78 years. Today we are a typical Western European country with strong commitment to rule of law, basic rights and individual liberties, aging population and high tax percentage. In parliamentary elections we are using the proportional representation with votes counted with the Hont system, meaning that the number one candidate gets the total number of votes for the whole list as his or her comparison number. Number 2 gets the half, number 3 1/3, number 4 1/4, and so on. The candidates are committed to party lists, but the voters are free to choose which person on the list they vote for, so it's not a closed list system. It's a combination of voting for a list and voting for an individual candidate. We have 12 election districts, and number of MPs elected from each one of these districts ranges from 6 in the smallest in Lapland to 37 in the biggest near Helsinki. In total there are 200 seats in the parliament, like I mentioned. And like Declan just told us, we just had parliamentary elections 1 month ago. Currently there are 9 parties represented in the parliament. The biggest ones are the centre-right National Coalition Party with 48 seats, National Conservative Populist True Finns with 46 seats, and Social Democrats with 43 seats. In the middle group there are former Agrarian Party Centre with 23 seats, the Greens, the Ecological Party with 13 seats, and the Left Alliance Party most on the left with 11 seats. Smallest 3 are the Voice of the Finnish-Swedish Minority, the Swedish People Party with 9 seats, Conservative Religious Christian Democrats with 5 seats, and then a liberal rightist movement now, which is ideologically a little bit difficult to explain, with only a single seat in the parliament. As we speak, 4 parties, namely National Coalition Party, True Finns, Swedish People's Party and Christian Democrats, are in the process of negotiating a coalition agreement and forming a new government. In Finland, forming a government is a flexible and creative process. Parties go to the elections without committing in advance to any certain coalition partnerships, but keep the options open. It all depends on what the election result is. Usually the biggest party becomes the prime ministerial party, and the second or the third biggest party takes the position of the main coalition partner. During the past 30 years, prime ministers have come from the 3 traditionally biggest parties, that is National Coalition Party, Social Democrats and the Centre Party. Almost all imaginable coalition combinations have been tried and have been in use, with all the parties, at least in principle, ready to become coalition partner with any other party represented in the parliament. Any Finnish coalition government in the most recent history has had at least 3, sometimes even 5 or even 6 parties. Never in the history of Finnish parliament has a single party held a majority position. Biggest parties used to be bigger than they are now. For example, Social Democrats with 63 seats in the 1995 elections. It happened in several elections that the 2 biggest parties had together the majority, that is 100 seats or over. However, after the elections of 2007, no party has been able to pass the 50-seat threshold. If the 4 parties currently in the negotiations manage to form a government, they will have 109 seats between them in the parliament. We don't have the instrument of constructive vote of no confidence that we discussed yesterday in the context of Germany. However, we haven't had a vote of no confidence in 66 years because the governments have ruled by strong parliamentary majorities. The last time we had a minority government was in 1977, and it looks like there won't be any continuation to this practice anytime soon. The only and most important task of putting the government feelers out seems to be to reach a good parliamentary majority that is well over 100 seats for the coalition. My task today here was to talk about how to empower both the government backbenchers and opposition MPs in a hung parliament to explore how they could play constructive roles in parliamentary committees, individual members' bills and initiatives, and non-governmental business time. I first have to disappoint you by telling that the power of opposition in Finland has dwindled down during the past 30 years significantly. In the beginning of 1990s, the minority protection quota legislation was abandoned in Finland. It had meant that any group of 67 members of the parliament out of 200, that is 1/3, could stop advancement of any bill and put it on the table over the next elections, meaning de facto killing it completely. This meant that in tight spots and with politically difficult pieces of legislation, a government had to negotiate with the opposition to guarantee the adequate level of support. So, if vote of no confidence is practically a dead letter and minority protections mechanisms are no longer in place, what motivates Finnish opposition politicians? That is a good question. Firstly, there is work in the committees, parliamentary committees. Committees are the place where an individual candidate still has the possibility of genuinely influencing the contents of a particular bill of legislation. With the skills of persuasion, argumentation and rhetorical flair, even an opposition MP can achieve significant changes in legislation. This explains why places in the high-profile committees, like the Constitutional Committee, the Grand Committee, which is responsible for the EU policies, and the Financial Committee, are eagerly contested among the members of the parliament, even in the opposition parties. Because of the dwindling down in size of the big parties, the parliamentary majorities have grown smaller in Finland. This creates a potentially active role for the opposition as well. Every now and then it happens that the government is internally so divided on some particular issue that the party leaders decides not to force individual MPs to vote for the government's bill in the parliament. This usually means that the bill doesn't get behind it necessary number of votes from the government ranks only, meaning that there has to be support from the opposition as well. And this, on its parts, empowers the opposition at least momentarily and gives its leverage in its proceedings with the government. Some to motivate the individual posts that in the parliament is the common ground. The idea of the better future is the same. There might want to bend the rules. You want to play by the might be. This differing political opinions. There has to be certainty that all political obey the rules set in the law. That coalition must be the same. In Finland, all political parties know that in 4 or 8 years, at most, they might have to cooperate as a coalition partner with any other party. They might have to cooperate as a coalition partner with any other party in the parliament. Parties in the government know that the current opposition parties will be in the next government or in the government after that. That brings forth a realization and conviction that while in the government you have to rule in a civilized manner.
Aim to do the work is critical. And also this question around, I would ask you referred to some of the more important committees in Finland, and it would be interesting to know if they are indeed permanent, if they have sort of permanent capacity, if they are institutionalized. But perhaps before we get to that, Kelvin, any thoughts from the number of committees, and you've tried on Marku and
especially the backpack, have when it comes to policy making, policy direction of the country. But of course, politics in is bargaining within the select committees, and that in bargaining aspiration is what we call development funds. All money years, and because, as I said, the public is not on the policy work, but on how much cash we can to our ground. Then we have to get more MPs, more. In fact, at that time, it was difficult to get them to come for me. Gain. When I have basic necessity of excellence or success as an MP to find consensus within a bipartisan nature, to find middle grounds and negotiation skills, and even trust within each other to push off an agenda that is good for the country as a whole. Can we renegotiate? How can we really come to a middle ground on policies that are important in the different parties and empower the get them ready to be a good, and that's where the training ground. My thoughts and
I think you're of MP. None of them. Some select committees are very highly contested because of the influence and the prominence that they can come with. So, select committees, some members of parliament position would actually think long and hard between taking a role as a chair of the committee because of the influence there. I think something that you all mentioned, institution, perhaps giving a role, and that's perhaps Marco, come back to that question about how prominent in Finland. I mean, permanent? Do they come with budgets? Are their chairs renewed? What's the institutional robustness there that can?
Yeah. Finnish system doesn't. It isn't like the Westminster system. It's a different kind of thing, and committees have a constitutional status. They are in the Finnish constitution, and the whole process of legislation relies on the existence of committees, so that whenever there's a new piece of legislation is first time handled in the general session, and it gets sent to a certain committee. Discussion is about what is the right committee for this or that particular legislation, and then the brunt of political work with a particular happens in the committee session. Then it's more about just accepting or declining the particular legislation. Wording of bill or draft that happens in the committee, and as mentioned in Finnish constitution, and this chairmanship really ordinary rank and if you are chairman of a committee, I think that to your salary if you are doing that, and and then elections, your part of those parties that form the people who tend to be those who are chairmen in the parliamentary committee, various political lives. So it's very established in Finnish. Committees are the place.
Question I had sort of linked to that, but also linked to this point of the. As I understand it, in Malaysia, there aren't actually committee places for every MP to serve on a committee. Is there space to increase that so that everybody has that opportunity to learn, as you said, to be?
There is space. It takes political will as well as the decision of the speaker on these they are. The decision is what they call home select committee, which decides on which select committee there is, and also the members that is in the select committee. So of course, at this of the select committees that was recently announced a few months ago, pushing for more. We'll select committee, but then at the end of the day, the committee decided they ministries within the government. Again, not a bad model, but I believe that hopefully in the future, more backbenchers, many backbenchers, especially backbenchers, they came to me and said, how can we get more involved in this select committee? Which is, I see something positive, because there is a greater appetite, especially the young generation of MPs, to be part of this legislative process.
If I could just add to that, I think, yes, there are only select committees, which, as Kelvin says, are various, but most of them quite bloated. The scopes of each of these committees are, they shadow more than one ministry, they shadow several ministries, they shadow half of one ministry and then a few other ministries, you know. And could there be more? Should there be more? Yes, obviously, yes, there should. As Kelvin says, there is an appetite, I think, for more, but we also have to be a little bit pragmatic. The Malaysian Parliamentary Select Committee system is still fairly nascent. The resources are not there yet. And I'm talking about both human resources as well as financial resources. We haven't quite established the necessary institutional requirements to make sure that these can run effectively in the long term. So they should be. I think we should all take the position that these first 10 are only a first 10, and with the potential to develop them moving down the line. But I do think, if I could also just respond to Kelvin's point, if I may, about building interest within MPs and politicians to actually take up these positions. And I think really perhaps one of the clearest ways to do that is to show that these committees can deliver results, that there is value from sitting in these committees. Now, of course, committees roughly do two types of work: pre-legislative work and post-legislative work. And save for Kelvin's committee, health committee, that he sat on and chaired, very few committees in the past have actually been successful or clearly successful in the pre-legislative stage. Not even in the post-legislative stage, but comparing the two, very few committees actually were given access during the legislative process, the passage of bills, to review bills. That was a huge problem. And I think if we can expand on that, if we can concretize the powers of these committees to do that, then the benefits are far more apparent, and the benefits are almost immediate. You can see the value of the work you do, I think, in these committees.
Just on that point then of expanding and concretizing, and also I appreciate that it's in its nascency at the moment, but in terms of that, the point you made about the sort of broad scope of some of the remits of these committees, would you, in an ideal world, and obviously not immediately, but would you advocate then that each ministerial position would have its own select committee, that it would be sort of each one would be matched by a specific oversight committee?
Well, I think we should probably move towards that direction, but there are obviously some areas which are cross-cutting,
Okay.
right? If we look at the issue of human rights, for example, is a very good example. It doesn't sit necessarily under a specific minister or ministry, and one would imagine that we should have, I believe, as a permanent standing committee, a committee that covers human rights, including, and also, of course, the issue of constitution and constitutionalism being another potential area. But yes, ideally, we should move towards a situation of ensuring that as few ministries are, as little overlap as possible in the mandates of and the scope of committees. But the other thing to also remember is that the cabinet structure changes. We don't really have a fixed, we have a few ministries which are fairly standard and fixed across different administrations, but oftentimes these switch. So we need to be aware of that too.
Yes, just just to give you a little bit more information about Finnish system. Any parliamentary committee has the constitutional right of inviting any minister from the government to inform it on particular issue. For example, if there's a piece of legislation that demands the presence of foreign minister, even the healthcare committee has the right of inviting a foreign minister to come and speak there. And Finnish ministers, they tend to take this rather seriously to inform the parliament, and this is also dealt by Finnish publicity. Newspapers are writing about how the ministers have been faring in committee hearings and so on. But then one thing that I didn't deal with in my presentation was that it has taken a long time in Finland to reach this mature level of parliamentarism and this working relationship between government and parliament, because I mentioned that in 1918 we had a civil war, and that created a situation for almost 20 years when the bourgeois side of the political spectrum did not want to cooperate with the working class parties. And it was the first time in 1937 when there was a common government, so that the Social Democrats were together in the government with the center-rightist groups. So it was almost 20 years to heal those wounds that were created in the civil war in 1918. And then it even took this existential crisis of an offensive from Soviet Union in 1939-1940 to be able to create this common consensus and national unity that was needed to create then in the post-war decades the Nordic welfare society. So it was a long time in coming, a very long process, 50 years or even more in Finland.
There's just, I think, one more question I'd ask before we open it up to questions from the audience, which is this issue of timing that came up earlier and also yesterday, because if I've understood it correctly, at the moment Parliament sits for about 70 days, and a hefty chunk of that is reserved for sort of government business and ministerial business, which leaves maybe not so much time for parliamentary select committees to make reports or have debates, and also private members. When you were part of your various committees, did you find it hard in order to sort of get your items on the agenda?
Actually, not really. Even though parliamentary sessions are limited, but then the select committees can call for meetings outside of parliamentary time. Okay. So the issues wasn't so much of timing. The issues were limitations imposed on us by certain standing orders. I can give you an example. Something that I've been fighting for since last time was to change Standing Order 83.4, which actually says that the committee can only function based on issues that are referred by the House. So some ministers or some public figures that are controversial uses these standing orders to not turn up for select committees hearing because this issue has not been referred by the House. And for an issue to be referred by the House, the majority has to agree. So if it's a controversial issue that is against the government of the day, why would the House want to refer it to the Select Committee? So that is where our limitations is formed. In my case, I'm a bit more privileged in the sense that the minister that we oversee, the health minister, and to a certain extent the science and innovation minister, they were open to come when we invite them. They don't use these standing orders against me, even though we asked the tough questions, and we were very active in the pre-legislative phase on trying to influence bills that the government wants to put forth. So it's not so much of time, but limitations is standing orders. Limitations is interest from the MPs, because number one, we need to get the quorum for us to sit. So if the MPs are not interested, we cannot get the quorums. And if we come out with a report, like my committee came out with 3 main reports, and we helped with two main legislations. In order to get a report out, we need the quorum of people to come. And if that report is, for example, not favorable to the government of the day, the government MPs may veto the report, and they are majority in the Select Committee. So I was the chairman, but I was an opposition member at that time. So that was one of the hurdles that I had to face. So that's why I said negotiations, coming to find a middle ground, that is the skill that we need to learn.
Okay, well look, I mean there's a lot there that I'd like to follow up on, but I think one of the notes from yesterday is that we need to move to the sort of Q&A with the audience quicker. So we'll open it up now to the audience. I think as with yesterday, we've got 4 microphones. I'll select maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. If you could just quickly introduce yourself and ask a question, that would be great. We'll start with Chin Wat and then this Mr. over here.
Thank you, Declan. I have a questions for our Malaysian panelists. We have 222 MPs here, minus 49 in the administrations and 2 deputy speakers. We have 171 MPs who are backbenchers and oppositions MPs. We have 90 seats in the 10 committees and 14 seats in the public account committees. That basically means that we have 57 MPs by default without any parliamentary committee responsibility. And we know the reason, as Maha pointed out, is that we do not have money to support all these committees. Question is, if we're going to set up 6 committees and each costs us 3 million a year, that will be only 18 million. How much in comparison is the loss that we suffer for having ill-considered, inadequately consulted public policies and laws? And the other questions that we have to think about is that we are paying some of the government backbenchers with lucrative jobs at government-linked companies. Why not we actually pay our MPs to do their jobs here in the House? How do we get out of this penny-wise, pound-foolish mentality? How can the parliamentarians, the media, and the civil society push for this shift in mentality, in thinking? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Ui Heng from the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall. I have 2 questions. One is, if we were to name only one, the most fundamental role of the parliamentarian, what is that? And then second question, what is considered a good parliamentarian? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think Chin Wat's question was for our Malaysian colleagues. So Maha, perhaps I'll ask you to start.
Yes, so I'll deal with the second point first. It's a little easier to answer. Yes, I do agree that we need to remunerate definitely committee chairs and even deputy chairs, I think, because of the amount of work that goes into it and that we're hoping these committees will now engage in. And of course, there are examples from other Commonwealth, Westminster-type parliaments. In Australia, I think they remunerate both the chair as well as the deputy chair. And I believe in the UK, the chairs get an additional allowance, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure there are more examples which I can't come to mind at the moment. So that's the second question. Now, on the first one, yes, so Chin Hua, you've of course commented on this publicly often. The fact that we have MPs really whose full potential are not being utilized. And this is also, of course, then really a waste of time. At the end of the day, there is so much that can be achieved through committees. And I would say even more so in a multi-party coalitional government structure that we currently have. Because, and this has been discussed by others before me, far more luminary people, that committee work and parliamentary work can actually be a platform for coalitions to police their bargains and to do so in a fairly stable political setting. So it is a loss of opportunity if we don't take advantage of that. What I would suggest is a practical solution while hopefully we move towards a position where our parliament can be better resourced, is let's not forget that these 10 committees with their very wide scopes and mandates could actually increase their members, the number of members that each committee has. And within that, to form even subcommittees. They have that power within the current standing orders. And perhaps in that way, expand the amount of work that they're capable of doing. But this is even so, it's not an alternative to actually creating more committees with more clearer shadowing abilities. Yeah.
Okay, just to share my experience. When I was the chair of the select committee, we were not paid any additional allowances. Eventually, at the end of the term, they did pass in the home committee. They say they'll pay a certain meeting allowances to the chair. But then I think the parliament was dissolved after that. But either way, I agree. As a politician, asking for more pay is always a sensitive issue in Malaysia. But I think the reality is we need to really give enough resources and to a certain extent incentivize whether the chair or the deputy to run a select committee, because there is a lot of work that actually goes into it. And we need to properly remunerate the work that has been done. I also agree in the sense what Ching Huat brought up, in the sense that I think that resources should be channeled mainly towards incentivizing MPs to be part of select committee and policy making processes rather than positions within agencies or even GLCs. But again, as I said, the mindset of Malaysia and the Malaysian expectations of politicians, that needs to change. Because sometimes the incentive of being in an agency, for example, is that I have political gains. I have access to the machinery of that agency where I can go into the ground and push my certain political agenda. And that's the reality of it. And that is why most politicians, I have to admit, prefer to be in such agencies rather in the select committee. Because such select committee is seen as an elite work rather than what the ground expects. So this is a mindset that we have to change, and hopefully resources properly channeled to where it matters, where Parliament is. And it's not just paying, actually I rather not be paid, but rather that locations be given into the research staff of the committee itself. That actually relieves a lot of our work, because even as a chairman, I had to go through the documents, do the research with my team and everything. And that's basically the big chunk of the work that has to be done. But if Parliament could invest into what we already have, but they themselves are also limited, but then if we can enrich and empower them, I think that's something that is good overall for the country and also the Parliament. To Heng's question, what's the main role of a parliamentarian? Again, depends on who you ask. As I said, we have grown up in this mindset, and I don't blame the people, because this is what we have conditioned. They have been conditioned by us politicians to be. It's easier to control if they are dependent on you. So if my job is just to dish out money, I don't have to be the smartest, I don't have to equip myself, I don't have to expand my knowledge, I don't have to challenge myself to be better, I just need to find money to give out money. So that is where, if we do not change that mindset, we will be stunted in our parliamentary democracy, in our parliamentary process, in our policy-making process, and the country cannot move forward, especially how to get more parliamentarians involved in policy-making. What Ching Huat mentioned just now, EU-advised policies, I don't think people have really done a study to quantify the impact of it, but I would assume a lot of it has certain effects. Like, I'm very proud to say when we were involved in a bill that has not been tabled, which was the tobacco control bill, the famous with the Generation Endgame in Malaysia. That bill itself, we went through the committee, and 70% of the bill itself was changed based on recommendations of the committee. So that shows the impact. And myself, I feel, even though I wasn't paid, but it's that passion project, you're part of that process. And I believe a lot of young MPs or even general MPs, they want to be part of that process to show that they really can make an impact. But with that said, there are of course some that see the political aim, which is how much money can I dish out to the ground? And that's what we here all have a role to play to try to change that mindset. How we empower the welfare agencies, how we empower other government agencies that's supposed to do the job. And we as MPs concentrate on what we are supposed to do.
Yeah, just to add a couple of comments on Finnish system. Most of the weekly working hours of Finnish parliamentarians are spent in the committees. There are, I think, 15 committees currently, and any parliamentarian MP is a member of at least 2 committees, and they are meeting 2 or 3 times a week, several hours at a time. So that is where the actual work of a Finnish MP is happening, in these committees, which are, like I said, mentioned already in the constitution. And then I want to answer the question about what is the most important task for a parliamentarian. Finnish constitution says that the state power in Finland belongs to the people, which is represented by the parliament. And there I have the answer to that question. The parliamentarian's most important task is to represent the people and try to somehow know as thoroughly as possible what the people wants, and that is a 24/7 job, I would say.
Just on this question of remuneration, but also recognition of the work of the committees, because I appreciate that it is very sensitive, and not just here, anywhere in the world where you see those headlines, Parliament votes itself a pay rise, it never goes down well, and you always need to have questions. But one of the ways that you can kind of talk through that is by making sure that people are aware of the work that's been done in the committees and the impact that they are having. And I wanted to ask, and just forgive my ignorance of the Malaysian context, but how accessible are the committees to average Malaysians? I mean, are the meetings televised? Are the reports public? Are there minutes made available? And if not, is there more that can be done in order to highlight the role that you're playing and the significant amount of work that goes into being part of a committee?
And this is something that, very good question. This is something that we have been pushing for, is for our select committees proceedings to be televised. Currently it's not. Only the main plenary session is televised. There are arguments to it. Okay, one argument is that if things are televised, then politics come into it, in the sense that certain MPs want to show off to their constituency, and it becomes more confrontational than constructive discussion. One of the good things in a select committee, there's no cameras. So I don't have to show, I don't have to play to my gallery, I can really discuss on policies. That's one argument. But I don't stand on that argument. My argument is I believe everything should be publicized, everything should be transparent. The only transparent thing, the only report that comes out to the public is when we have agreed upon the report. In the sense that we have done the proceedings on a selected topic or a selected bill, then if it's approved by the committee, as I said, to get a report, we need that consensus as well. Once it's approved, then it is released. And once it's released, the minutes of the proceeding will be released. Of course, before it's being released, it has to be sent to the different agency or the different stakeholders that have been involved, and they have a right to refuse certain things that can be redacted from the report. So that's the current practice in Malaysia. I think it can be improved.
Yes, let's take some more questions. The lady here, perhaps the gentleman standing up, and then the lady in the back, and then you, sir.
Who's first? He or me? You. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Yoklin, Ho Yoklin. I'm from All Women's Action Society. OAAO, not OLD. Okay, in short, it's AWAM. We have talked a lot about the structure currently in the Parliament, the Select Committee. But I think that one of the core issues that really concern us is the political structure that is starting from young, right? In Malaysia, our children are not taught the democracy in the schools. And why we were taught about being honest. But when they grow up, working in society is not the issue anymore. Honesty is just by the way, or is not there at all. So what I mean is that our parliamentarian, when they enter the politics through the political parties, what sort of criteria and quality are we talking about? And have there been any really substantive grooming process about how do you make policy, how do you argue, how do you serve your constituency? Just now, the gentleman just now asked, what is the role of the parliamentarian? So at the end of the day, people go to parliament, it's very lucrative. It's a lucrative business. You can make a lot of money through being an MP. And you just sit in the parliament and doing nothing at all. So what I mean, at the end of the day, even though we make a lot of changes currently, all right, it is a push and pull effect. If there is no push element at the other end, the pull, how much we're trying to do somewhere, it's going to take a year. I'm not saying it will not be taking shape, but it will, but it's going to take a year. So the consciousness of the rakyat, of the people, have to be there, and also the political party, because that is the primary, the kindergarten session for a politician. And I know that people just come into being just an assistant of the MP, then immediately say, I want to be an MP. And yet they are not aware of what is MP's roles about, because there is no training. A lot of NGO doing such training, but there is not from the political party. That may be, which I'm not aware of, but I think that the starting point actually is from where we were before we want to become a politician and advocates for a riot representative, but also the political party is a very important a doorstep for people who want to become a politician. Thank you, that's my view. Thank you.
Sorry, excuse me, ma'am, thank you very much for your comment. This is Senator Ras. I think it's unfair for you to say, I'm from the upper house, I think it's unfair for you to say that it's a lucrative business, because we do it because we are here for the people. So I beg to differ on that. I'd like to correct that if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Senator, while you have the microphone, actually, I understood that you had a question as well.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Marco, I have the privilege of meeting him yesterday. We chatted a bit. You mentioned about we have to respect the different opinions and attitude of compromise and being invasive in downfalls in government. But I'd just like to ask you a bit about in Finland. We are very happy to see a lot of women leaders in the government. And your previous Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, I've been reading that some of her downfalls and how the Finnish people, what they feel towards her time as the Premier. Perhaps you could share with us on that, and perhaps what is the future of women parliamentarians in the government? Thank you.
Thank you. So, and then I think we'll take one more question. You can answer, and then we'll come to you afterwards.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Yit Fei from Agora. The question is more about accountability of the select committee that you have been talking about. As we are talking about incentive for the MPs to become part of the select committee, what are the mechanisms that we can use to hold these select committees member accountable as they gain more and more influence and power? For example, just now we heard about the influence that 70% of the bills successfully amended. What actually happened during this negotiation? Is this information accessible to the public? And what's the right level of transparencies and accountability that we can expect?
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to start on that series of questions?
Okay, I think I have the easiest task to answer the question about women in Finnish politics. This has been a situation already for 20 years that the ratio of female politicians and male politicians has been somewhere, so that when we have 200 MPs, at least 90 of them have been female, and 110 approximately so. And I don't remember the exact figures now from 1 month ago, the most recent parliamentary elections, but I would say that it was so that there were something like 95 female candidates and 105 male candidates. And the funny thing for the past 4 years was that we had a 5-party coalition government, and at times all the leaders of those 5 parties were female politicians, and this was an international news, as you know. There were these pictures shown Sanna Marin as the premier, but all the other party leaders, all the other 4 female politicians as well. Well, now we are in the process of forming a government that we will get this very traditional looking guy as the next prime minister, guy who I was studying together with in 1990s in Turku University, guy with glasses and a little bit strong middle section as a 50-year-old guy we tend to have. But even now, although we are going to get a government which is politically on the right, it's rather conservative as well. 3 other party leaders will be female politicians. So this is a very Scandinavian thing, and something that is typical, has been typical for Finnish politics for quite some time now, that the most or the majority of the most important politicians have been now female politicians for quite some time now. But it has taken time, because when you look at the Finnish constitution, I would say that from 1960s, 1970s onwards, the situation was so that there have been no legal constraints on a Finnish female individual of reaching as high a position as possible in Finnish society. But it didn't happen overnight. Still in 1990s, there were many ministerial portfolios that had never been held by a female politician. Gradually then it became a more normal thing for a government minister to be a female politician. And now for 10 years or 15 years we have been in a situation when I would say gender or sex is not an issue anymore in Finnish politics. It can be a male politician or female politician, but it's this 100-year story, or even more. The first Finnish parliament was elected in 1907, so 115 years ago, and it has been a long trip. It took, like I said, in 1990s we started to reach this sexual equality between men and women politicians.
Maha, Kelvin, your thoughts perhaps on the other questions about accountability, transparency, and I think the sort of values and motivations?
So to take the question on education around civic knowledge and democracy, yes, obviously it's lacking. It's not a core part of the school syllabus as yet, and what is available, particularly at university level, is fairly top-down. It prioritizes the state. And it deprioritizes citizens' rights. So yes, that needs to be corrected, without a doubt. And this comes back to the question, the point that I made at the very beginning, about having a common belief system. Starting from a common ground. What is our common ground? And yes, obviously the education and the efforts need to start at school level. Now, in terms of what's happening with MPs, I can't speak to the level of training that they get at a party level. I'm sure it varies from party to party and from time to time. But I can say that we have seen an evolution where that's concerned post-2018. Now, the parliamentary rules are complex. The parliamentary process is complex. And before you can even start educating and training, it needs to be broken down and understood. And the speaker that came in after 2018, the speaker that took over, and even the current speaker have prioritized this to different extents. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I, for example, was tasked in each of these different administrations to do various things around training of MPs and training of MPs' officers. And we continue to do that. So I'll leave that there. But if I could just add one more point about this issue of education, and I hope this isn't too controversial. But political education, and particularly education around parliament and parliamentary processes, it isn't just for the MPs in this House. It is also for all stakeholders who wish to engage MPs in this House. If you wish to push for a more inclusive and participatory parliamentary process, then it is incumbent upon you to also learn what are the rules, what are the processes, how can we intervene, how do we need to upskill and perhaps even reskill ourselves so that we can add value to the process. The final question, I think, was on the accountability of committees. I think I'm sure Kelvin is probably in a better position to answer this, but I think structurally speaking, the accountability process is built into the fact that at the very most what comes out of a committee is its final report and recommendations. For it to have any sort of permanent impact or effect, it still needs to well, if we're looking at a pre-legislative stage, it still needs to be presented to the House and accepted by the House, if we're talking about pre-legislative stage.
Just a brief comment about how to be a parliamentarian. In Finland, Finnish Parliament offers this educational introductory course to all the people who get elected to the Parliament, and I have been part of that course myself for 2 times or 3 times already, and now. And funnily, the main problem or obstacle with that course is that we don't get the new parliamentarians to attend. They are nowhere to be seen when these courses are being held.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, thank you for the questions and issues that's been raised. I know one of the concerns raised was whether parliamentarians earn a lot of money being in parliament. And well, we know it's not true, but we have to acknowledge this is the perception that the public has, and this is something that we need to address and even to educate. I believe that education, especially civic education in Malaysia, has to be reformed. The fact of the matter, my batch, many years ago, the only time we learned about the role of an MP or even a state assembly was in a subject called Pengajian in Form 6, when that's 18 years old. And many students do not go to Form 6 because they go to either pre-college, A-levels and stuff like that. So they actually never learn the role of an MP of an adun until they have to vote sometimes. So this is where we need to reform. Actually, there were a lot of conversations talking about reforming our civic education, especially after the implementation of Undi 18. I believe that it should be taught in school, especially what parliamentary democracy is, not on partisan politics, but on participatory politics. How can we as the people be involved with the democratic process and everything? So this is something that we need to really look in, and it's not just a role of a parliament, but it's a role of all ministries. I like what the parliament did the past few days, where they had this Rumah Terbuka, open house of parliament. I think this gives optics or even an image that parliament is close to the people. A lot of times, people are scared to come into parliament. Many other parliamentary countries that I visited, parliament buildings, people just walk in. People just come in, they don't have to dress their Sunday best. They just come in what they're wearing on that particular day, and they can observe the proceedings. In Malaysia, of course, I understand the culture, I understand the context, I understand certain issues, but then the perception is far from the people, and I think this is something we need to change. So an open day, it's a good move, but I think more has to be done to get it to close that gap between the people and MPs as a whole. I think to answer the question on accountability mechanism, as I said, the one thing I would like to see, especially this term, and I myself will be lobbying very hard with the speaker, is to change the standing order for sessions to be live streamed, televised. And to a certain extent, I think that's where we MPs remain accountable to the people. The competency, our competency, the things we say, what we bring to the table, the inputs that we have, and this is supposed to challenge us so that we get better in what we do. Currently, as I said, there are a lot of hurdles and limitations. The only transparency or at least accountability is when a report is being released. And to release a report is not easy. The fact is I have 2 more reports that is pending in the Health Committee, but it cannot be released because I'm no more part of the Health Committee. So all the efforts that we have done in it will not be made public knowledge. One is the review of COVID-19, and the other one is the review of the Infectious Disease Act that they wanted to increase the fine. So there are a lot of process to get it through, but sadly the Parliament dissolved before we managed to get it through. I hope talking to the upcoming new chairman of the Health Committee to bring it up and then at least get the report out. So it's very post-work rather than during the work kind of thing, and that's where we need to move forward and have some reforms and improvements. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another round of questions. We'll start with the lady here. Sir, then to you, and perhaps the lady at the back then.
Thank you. I'm Mary Magdalene Pereira from Aliran. I just want to pick on a salient point which came up in yesterday's presentations as well as today's, and just touched on also by Yoklin just now on values. So our distinguished speaker today also talked about the importance of having a political culture with common aspirations and values. Maha talked about a common belief system, and YB Calvin talked about mindsets. So while we acknowledge that it is important to put in place systems and structures and procedures which are right, which will promote democracy, which will strengthen democracy, we also need to have the right individuals within operating those systems and procedures. So my question is, I know there's a lot of cynicism among some people regarding the new Prime Minister's initiative about Masyarakat Madani, having a civilized society. I was just wondering, how would especially our local speakers, how would you assess this initiative? Would you see that as an effective way to create the much needed congruence of values and aspirations, especially values and aspirations that prioritize the common good? This initiative is not just for parliamentarians, but for ordinary Malaysians to realize that the emphasis is on integrity, on good governance, on sustainability, and the fact that we as voters must take ownership of the future of our country, and whoever sits in parliament, we are the ones who put them there, and therefore we are the masters of our destiny. Okay. So how would you assess the success, or do you have confidence in this initiative of the Prime Minister in promoting this congruence of values based on good governance, integrity, and sustainability? My second, can I have a second question?
Just very quickly,
perhaps. Yeah. My second question is in relation to what the distinguished speaker yesterday, Mr. Chris Hayes, talked about, one of the ingredients of having an effective opposition, and which is discipline, unity of purpose. I was just wondering, how would you strike a balance between party discipline and autonomy of backbenchers and opposition MPs to vote according to their conscience? How does that work in practice? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, thank you. The topic for this session is empowering parliamentarians. So my first observation is that it seems that the answer from this morning discussion is the only solution is to set up select committees, because all the talking is about select committees. I'm sure there are some other ways. But having said there is select committees, but I don't think select committees is the O and N-O to it. Yesterday, one of the distinguished speakers, Wan Junaidi, former law minister, he has gone through the process of amending the law, even the constitutions, 2 times in his less than 2 years. He has done by engaging civil society, engaging parliamentarians from both of the parliament. That can be done without select committee. One danger of select committee, you look at the American system, a lot of committees, live telecast, they came in, mindset is fixed already, I'm going to achieve certain targets. not to listen, not to influence. So there's a danger to it too, right? My second point here is that the type of parliamentarians empowering them, we have to move back even one step further to the fundamental. What type of parliamentarians do we have? How is the process of parliamentarian being elected? I'm not sure about Finland or other countries, but in Malaysia, one of the serious problem, flaw in our system is gerrymandering. Our parliamentarians are elected by a constituency, physical geographical constituency. And there's a huge discrepancy where we are sitting, or Putrajaya, where the seats of power, has 42,000 voters, 42,800 voters, one member of parliament. Damansara, I think in this area, P106, has 240,000, one parliamentarian. My constituency in Sarawak Sibu has 120,000. The setup of Malaysia, going back to history, under Section 13, Section 2 of our Constitution, make it such a way, because Malaysia was a developing country, they want to help the rural area to develop faster, giving more funds through member of parliaments. That's what Kevin was saying. Parliamentarians tend to become service provider rather than policy makers. That thing has gone extreme. In 1957, our constitution has 15% guideline, limit of difference between the most number of voters and the least number of voters is 15%. That was reduced to 50% by 1976. The parliamentarian themselves entirely done away with. The system is being abused. How are we going to deal with it? And I think my challenge I throw to BERSIH as the organizing people of this, and fighting for fair election, fair votes, one person, one vote, take up this challenge, rebalance, one person, one vote. Get rid of gerrymandering. Take that as a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, madam.
Hi, Adila, a postgraduate student from University Malaya. I have two questions. The first one, can the institutional reforms be done or be moved by the civil servant instead of the MPs? Because at times, it might take weeks to months for a coalition or unity government to be established post-election. So can the institutional reforms continue being done during that particular time or even after that? And question number 2, what makes a good parliamentary officers, and should the parliamentary research officers be hired by the parliament or should MPs be given a location to hire their own research team? Thank you.
Thank you. Right, another great round of questions there. Who would like to start?
Thank you so much again for the very thought-provoking questions and also input. I think I'll answer from our friend, the lady from Aliran. Basically, she asked for how can we assess the current success of the Malaysian Madani model. Again, I think it's not fair for us to assess it right now. It's only been introduced for the past few months. And I think it has to be assessed over the period of years, whether short-term, mid-term, and long-term, and whether the Prime Ministers and of course the Cabinet and the government and the Rakyat as a whole, can we really achieve that? I myself, to be honest, I didn't know what the word Madani actually meant, but after researching it, I saw the richness of what the Prime Minister wants to bring. And the challenge we have now is how can we market it to the people on the ground? Because again, for me, when it comes to branding, if somebody needs to pick up a dictionary to look at what it means, then we have an extra challenge. But with that said, the spirit and what the Prime Minister wants to bring is something that we all should champion, especially if we want to see a Malaysia that prioritizes good governance, anti-corruption, and of course, a respect for multiculturalism and diversity in Malaysia. My colleague from Mr. Robert has raised really important questions, and I agree to a certain extent. I agree fully. There are other ways that I think parliamentarians can play their role besides the select committee. He gave an example of the former law minister, which I think, even though we're from different parties, I think he has done a good job in terms of pushing certain reforms. But some of the reforms that he pushed went through a select committee as well. So that is where the importance of the select committee. Why I believe in a select committee is because I believe in accountability. We cannot be dependent on a good minister. We have to be dependent on a good system to empower a good minister. So that is where I think it is important for us. Of course, there are other ways MPs can find, but it does not discount the importance of the select committee. Again, the other input he gave on gerrymandering, again, fully agree. But the abuse happens because parliamentarians pass those laws. Parliamentarians pass constitutional amendments historically that has been maybe hazardous to our situation, and that is why the parliamentarians need to be empowered, parliamentarians to understand what they are voting for. And I think in those days, they basically vote based on what the party whip or what the government of the day asked them to vote for. And it's not something that we want. I understand that the other question was how to balance between autonomous or what we call conscious voting and party whip. I'm going to give you a very good, I'm going to give you a personal experience, at least in my party. Okay, my party is the DAP. My party leaders have never told me how to vote for only certain bills. Yes, budget, the main budget bill, vote of no confidence if there was, and important financial bills. Those bills which maybe can affect the stability of a government or the collapse or viability of a government, I think the whip comes up. But all the other bills I can share with good conscience, we were not told how to vote and not to vote. In most cases, a lot of the MPs, if they do not agree with a certain bill, they just don't turn up for the voting itself. So again, it may not be the best answer, but I think that's generally what is practiced, at least from my party perspective and also in Parliament. Sorry to add for the previous question, whether we were trained, get the education before becoming an MP. My party, again, sorry, because I only can share from a perspective of my party, we do have a lot of trainings for the officers, assistants. Even right now, we have a training program on public policy for transportation and urban planning for a group of about 30 young people within the party. So I think in each and every party there is their own political education, exposure and everything. So I had to go through that process as well before I was given the opportunity to run in an election. The last question was on parliamentary officers. Can constitutional reforms be done by civil servants? The groundwork can be done by civil servants. Look, civil servants are so important, very, very important. I always say this, if we empower the civil servants, if the civil servants were empowered, they were accountable, and they were given a mechanism to even keep in check their ministers, a lot of the scandals that happen in our country would not have happened. But with that said, for a reform or bill to pass, you need the MPs to pass it in Parliament. So that is why we cannot mutually exclusive say, can the civil servant do it at the expense of the MP, or can the MP do it at the expense of the civil servants? We have to find ways, instead of competing, we have to find ways to complement one another. We all play that role. What makes a good parliamentary officer? Should research officers be hired by Parliament? Or I don't have a position on that. I think at the end of the day, I think there are two sides to it. Maybe Maha can give a better answer on this, but I don't have a position on that. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So I'll take Mary Magdalene's first. I am of a similar view on the concept of Masyarakat Madani as Calvin. I think it's premature at the moment to discuss whether it is successful or could be successful or otherwise. But what I hope is that when we are looking at when we talk about empowering society, or when we talk about giving agency to society, specifically in terms of involvement in policy ideation, in agenda setting. Now, these things they don't happen in a vacuum. They need to be built into institutions, into the structures of institutions. So we do come back to institutional reform and institutional development. And I think because institutions obviously build culture, they support positive culture. And I think in terms of Parliament, coming back to Parliament, one of the key things that we really need to focus on, and I hope this government will focus on, is the recreation of an independent parliamentary service. That's essential. I don't think we can be assured of agency and independence from the executive until we have that. And if I can then just tie that back to Adila's question about parliamentary offices. Now, I think as a general rule, there should be, as I said, an independent service for Parliament with the power to hire and fire their own officers. In terms of research officers specifically, I think each MPs will have different views on this. Some may prefer to have their own research officers. Maybe they feel a better level of trust and understanding in that. But regardless of that, we do need to have, Parliament needs to have its own specialized research body, which it does, but it is severely undercapacitated and under-resourced. So that needs to be improved as well. Now, finally, on the point about empowering Parliament, yes, unfortunately, most of this discussion has focused on committees. I did hope that we could talk about other aspects, such as time for opposition time or backbencher time. And tied into that, the ability of MPs to put forward their own motions and their own, perhaps even bills. Now, but I do want to raise that point about Wan Junaidi, which actually Kelvin has already done. Now, not all MPs, not all ministers are Dato Sri Wan Junaidi in terms of his level of consultation. And as Kelvin has said, even he, as you heard yesterday, struggled. So you could have a consultation process with the most open minister possible, but if it fails in cabinet, then your only solution lies in the House, which is what happened with the anti-hopping laws. Now, the other problem with that is this, that currently in our executive, we do not have embedded either a structure or a culture of consultation with stakeholders. We don't. So it is very dependent on individual ministers. Now, I'll give you an example from the UK, if I may, very quickly. Now, in the UK, the culture has changed so much that now there are manuals and guidelines for ministries to actually put their draft bills, not the bills, but to try and send draft bills to the relevant committees in the House. So before it even goes to the House, just to get comments. Now, the committee can choose not to look at a draft bill and feedback comments to the relevant ministry. But at an executive level, that is how the culture there has changed over time. We're not even there yet. So I think at this point in time, we do have to place a lot more reliance on the work of Parliament itself in the scrutiny of bills. I believe that's all the questions. Yeah.
Sure, but and I think Marco wants to say a point about this actually, but let's take a moment maybe to go into some of these other ways, and particularly the point you mentioned about backbenchers. But Marco...
Just a quick comment. We in Finland, we have this independent information service in the parliament, which I think it employs something to 20 to 30 people. And about gerrymandering, that is the most important criteria of the divide of the Finnish geographical area to different electoral districts. And the current number of people per one parliamentarian is depending on the district from 22,000 to 26,000 voters per one seat in the parliament, and all the 200 seats are situated within this number. So, and whenever this changes, then the number of seats available in a particular electoral district changes as well.
Let's just pick up on this then. I think we will have time a few more minutes for more questions too. But this question about individual members' bills, I don't think there's been one adopted or passed in Malaysia in the last 50 or 60 years. You referred to similar problems in Finland in terms of it being very hard, but you also talked about the benefits that can come with the opportunity, at least, to put a bill forward for debate and deliberation. How can that be rectified here? I mean, how could you create better avenues for individual members to put forward bills with a good chance that they would actually be taken up?
Yeah, so I think we need to be a bit realistic. We have a parliamentary system. So this idea then, the idea of a parliamentary system obviously is that the majority in the House is the one that is in power at executive level, right? Basic principle. What that then means for private members' bills, and especially if it's an opposition bill, is that the chances of success are low. Now, that in itself doesn't mean that you don't create a process for it or a platform for it, because there are other benefits around the presentation, the discussion of private members' bills that can feed into better policies, right? And now I would draw a similar line to the proposing of amendments to existing government bills. Both processes should be improved in Malaysia. Now let's focus just briefly on the process for private members' bills in Malaysia. It is so onerous. It is so onerous because before you can even bring a bill to the House, you need to get the House permission. So a member who wants to bring a private member's bill to the House must first put a motion in the House to ask for permission to bring a bill. And because it's a private member's motion, it falls to the bottom of the list in terms of agenda, and because I didn't touch on the point about timing in the House, and because the agenda of the House is completely governed by the government of the day, it usually only sets just enough parliamentary days for government business. There is no time at all for private members' business. So even getting that first motion through is a struggle and in fact impossible. So those things need to change. One of the ways you can try and address that is by setting aside and ring-fencing time within the parliamentary calendar for private members' business. And this would include not just the opposition, but also backbench MPs. So if you set, for example, half a day in a week, to start with, for private members' business, where you can bring up bills, you can also bring up other motions to discuss issues of interest, and also to discuss committee reports, which is something that is not fit into our agenda, our parliamentary agenda. So that too goes missing. So that's one way in which I think we can improve opportunities for private members, whether it's opposition or backbench. And that point also ties into the earlier question about how do you balance discipline, right? Party discipline, especially in a multi-party system, hung parliament, coalition politics, versus autonomy. Now, it is a struggle. It is a struggle, and the most that most MPs can do, as Kelvin says, is to just not be there during a vote, right? Now, the options that we've talked about today, setting up a committee system, as well as opposition time, is to me like a fuse valve. It gives an opportunity for whether it's backbench or opposition MPs to be able to air out their positions without necessarily affecting the stability of the government of the day.
Thanks. Kelvin, any thoughts on that? You were nodding in agreement.
I fully agree.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we do actually have time for perhaps another round of questions before we break for lunch. Kokin, perhaps, and then the gentleman at the back, and then the lady beside him.
Hi, thank you everyone. Welcome back. My question is actually for Dr. Maku. So is it okay if I say it now and then you repeat to him because he's on break?
Wait until he comes back.
Yep.
Okay,
Maybe
yeah.
the others one can start first.
Good morning. So my name is Chang Sis from SDSNA office. My question is more towards Kelvin, YP Kelvin's. I believe that beside the first batch MP, there are much more experienced MP, a big group of experienced MPs in state or federal levels inside and become a private members now. Those experienced MP might be previous member of administrations. So I think you experience some of the tights in standing order, as you mentioned before, your frustrations. So may I know your plans or actions plans among the private MP or backbenchers to gather some of the consensus to push for the standing order reform? Because I think there are some of the proposed in the civil society, including much work done by Maha, but the power to amend the standing order lies in the MP. So how would you do to gather all the consensus so this amendment can be pushed and realized, not only urged and lobby to the Speaker office? That's the first point. Second point is much more about public funded parliamentary officers, not so much on parliamentary officer research itself, but also the officers for MP, because we know that many political talents is discovered through the service to MPs, probably the assistant stage in the early stage, but most of them are not well funded, especially not public funded, unlike some of the countries in UK or also in Asia's regions like Taiwan's. But if they are not public funded, you can't attract good talents to involve in political works. So is there any positions or thoughts on these issues, like public funded MP assistant and officers? Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ferry Bell from an organization called Pusat Komas. Just a couple of questions, and one of it is like a lot of discussion today is very much related to the Parliament Services Act. So how far are we with this act? I know it was there and then it was removed, and today it's somewhere there floating. So how far are we to our local speakers? And secondly is we are speaking a lot on parliament reform. What about the state legislative? Because I know this is where the gaps are as well at the state level. At state level, I believe it's a lot more weaker, and many of the voters, they are unable to even come here and be here or be participative in any of the discussions at Parliament. So state is where they are close, they are much closer. So probably Maha, you would have done some research on that, on state legislative. So some enlightenment on that, and what I believe is that different states, we have 13 states, and each state have got different procedures. So how are we going to synchronize this, and is that even possible? And in terms of education itself, we speak a lot that it has to go back in the school system. But also I believe that the members of parliament as well as state assembly person themselves, I think the grooming could also come with them as well, who wants to stand. That means they have to be accountable themselves to be educated and not just jumping into politics just because they have the passion for politics. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think, Kelvin, some of those first questions were for you anyway, but perhaps as we're nearing the end of time, you could answer and then make any final comments or observations you have as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I think to the first question, what are we doing to amend the standing orders? Just to inform you, last year, I think it was the beginning of last year, the speaker at that time called a meeting together with all the chairmen of the different select committees with the Law Minister, Tan Sri Wan Junaidi. We were in that meeting, and basically myself and a few chairmen, Dato Sri Azalina, who is the Law Minister now, we were pushing for that common agenda on how to empower the select committees by amending those standing orders. At that time, if I'm not mistaken, it was February. The Law Minister at that time gave us an assurance that by July, that standing order will be amended. However, we do not know why. I actually went and see the speaker again, and he says that there were certain complications, but they are working at it, and eventually the parliament got dissolved, and so on and so forth. But moving forward, what's going to be done? Basically, once all the chairmen for the new select committees has been formed, this is one of the agendas that I'll be pushing them to have that meeting with Dato Sri Azalina as well as the Speaker of the House, to push for those amendments, because to amend the standing orders, he has to go to a standing order committee, he has to go to the home committee, and it's not purely just the MPs itself, but then the parliament itself has to, the committees need to have that political will to do so. So this is what we are going to do, and I'm very optimistic because Dr. Sri Azalina's inside, and she was the one, I still remember in that meeting, poking me, Kelvin, fight for it, fight for it, fight for it. So yeah, so now that she's inside, let's hope that changes. The second one, in terms of public funded parliamentary workers, just to inform you, currently as a government MP, we're given Community Development Fund, CDF, and part of it, 300,000, is for our office, so we can hire staff and stuff like that. The issue is when it comes to the opposition MPs. I was in opposition, I was a government, then opposition, then government now. We were not given at that time, so that's where we were very limited, our resources. My pocket, basically my whole salary was to my staff at that time, so that's where it is a bit limited. I am for more institutionalized funding for both sides, especially when it comes for staffing, because you want an MP to perform to the best of his capacity, whether in opposition or not. You need to empower his ecosystem, he or her ecosystem, and that is very, very important. So the last questions, Select Committee Service Act progress. We don't have an answer for you now. I think it has to go through the cabinet, but from what I'm hearing, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think this government and this speaker especially is very for it. So something as an MP, I'll raise in Parliament and push for updates on the progress of it. Yeah.
So on the standing order amendments, I think Kelvin has already explained the process. So it is fairly laborious. There are a number of steps that any proposed amendments have to go through. But yes, we haven't, I personally don't know what progress there is in making these amendments and what they will cover. But it is something that we do need to push for moving forward, alongside, as I said, critically, the Parliamentary Services Act. Now, in terms of addressing the point about state legislative assemblies that was raised by Faribel. Yes, so state legislative assemblies, of course, the way in which they work, their procedures, their processes, and access to members of public to those houses has to be improved. But we also must remember that because of this very centralized system of government that we have in Malaysia, the jurisdiction given to various states is actually rather minimal. So I would imagine, while there is a host of issues which are of interest to society and to civil society in particular, that may sit with the state, more often than not, the issues that are of concern to you actually sit here in this house. But in terms of improvements, yes, the states and their legislative bodies operate quite differently, but we do see some commonalities. For example, almost all state assemblies, if not all, have a form of parliamentary questions, which, as most of you would know, is a very useful tool of getting information and data from the government and to raise issues of interest. I think that was it, unless I missed a question.
I think so, and I think we'll probably leave it there for this morning. That's been a long discussion. We've asked a lot of our panelists, so thank you very, very much. Thank you to all the questions and the participation. I think that was a very rich discussion. We did spend a lot of time on parliamentary committees. But I think there were some very concrete suggestions and recommendations there that can be taken forward. So we'll leave it there. I think lunch will be in the same place next door, and if I understand correctly, I'll let you do it.
Thank you, Declan, and the panelists for this very lively discussions. I think this is one that has many hand raised, and we managed to answer all the questions. I would like to now invite Thomas to give a token of appreciation to the moderator and the panelists. So today we are more relaxed. I can see people are taking pictures, smiling on the camera. So if you take pictures and want to post it on your social media, I would like to invite you guys to put the hashtag #MyDemocracy, MY-Democracy, so that this event and this message can spread wide across. Lunch is served at the same place like yesterday. We have 1 hour for lunch, so be back at 1 o'clock, and we will start the last sessions on the role of civil society and the media in this democratization process. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch and have some chit chat with your friends and make some network during lunch as well. So don't forget to put the hashtag #MyDemocracy in all your social medias. Thank you.